If you've been following up till this point, we have learned how attackers go about gaining initial access to your machine. We learned how attackers then use a combination of privilege escalation and lateral movement techniques to go from limited user privileges to gaining more control over your machine. We then took a look at persistence mechanisms, or in other words, how attackers stay on your machine for an extended period of time. In this video, we're going to put it all together and we're going to talk about the defense strategy that we can take against these sorts of actions. I'm going to base this off of the defense strategy that Illinois Tech used in 2022 to win the NCAE Cyber Games nationally. If you go back to this GitHub repository that I've been referencing in numerous videos, once again, as a reminder, that's at github.com/redefiningreality/linux-defense-materials. Go ahead and scroll down, and under Linux Defense, you should see this defense checklist. This checklist is the checklist that Illinois Tech used a couple of years back in the NCAE Cyber Games competition. However, as I learn more about Linux, keep going back in and updating this checklist, removing things that I think are less important and adding things that I think are more important. So it's an even better version of that original checklist. There are two parts when it comes to the defense portion of the NCAE Cyber Games competition. Part 1 is getting your services set up in a secure way before you actually bring your machines online. We call that preventative defense, and the goal there is to remove as many vulnerabilities as possible before we expose our machines. After that, after we get everything set up, then we move to active or detective defense, where we actually monitor the network traffic and we take a look at logs and see how the attackers are getting in. In previous videos, we covered all the things that you really need to know about that active defense and looking at log files and looking at network traffic. So in this video, we're really going to talk about how to get those services set up in the first place, how to configure your machines securely before you bring them online. The number one strategy that made us successful in cyber defense competitions, and the number one thing that I recommend to you, is before you make anything accessible, secure it first. So our strategy was, we sacrificed some potential service points. We didn't bring up our services right away. Instead, we fixed all of the vulnerabilities in our services. And as soon as we fixed as many as we possibly could, only then did we bring it up online. As soon as Red Team gets in and takes down your service, our strategy was to leave that service down so that the attacker can't use it to get back in again. Instead, we would go in, we would take a look, figure out how the attacker got in, fix the vulnerability, and only then bring the service back up. The downside of this is you lose some service points, but that is certainly worth it for building an effective defense that then causes you to score more points later on in the competition. When it comes to this first part of the competition, which is getting these services set up and configuring them, there's a lot to do. As you'll see in this video, I'll work with one machine in particular. However, you have probably 4 or 5, maybe more machines that you have to perform these steps on. And so I recommend dividing tasks among different members of your team. The way we approach that is we actually created a separate checklist for each machine in the competition. So once we already knew what the environment would look like, we went ahead and we created checklists for what to do on each machine. And we could give those checklists over to different people. And we have maybe one person working on each machine, or one person for 2 or 3 machines, right? And that way we can get those services up and running at the beginning of the competition as soon as possible. Although I didn't make those per machine checklists public, I did make our general Linux checklist public. So this is the general Linux checklist that Illinois Tech followed. And from here, we took this general Linux checklist and we created separate checklists for each machine. If you take a look at this general checklist, you'll see that it has all the things that are on that defense checklist that we're going to take a look at in a second, the one that I previously mentioned, but it tells you how to do each of them and includes commands where necessary. In addition, I have different configuration things that you need to know for the different machines that you might encounter, including what packages to upgrade depending on what machine you're setting up, and all the firewall rules that you need for each machine. So you're more than welcome to use this as a reference. Keep in mind things may change from year to year, so some of the things on here may no longer be relevant. And at the same time, this is what we did a couple of years ago, and since then, at least I feel like I've come a long way in my own knowledge, and maybe there are things I would add to this that aren't currently on here. Those things I'm going to talk about in this video. Going back to the main page on the GitHub repo, scrolling down and taking a look at that defense checklist. First, let's talk about the big idea. If you're following along, you probably realize there's a ton of different ways that attackers can escalate privileges, and there's a ton of different ways attackers can maintain persistence. Understanding all of these different ways, most of it requires understanding some specialized Linux concepts, and it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to know them all in advance. So, attackers have the advantage once they're already on your machine. However, when it comes to initial access, there's only a few ways attackers can get in, and that's through a vulnerable service that you have publicly exposed. That's where defenders have the advantage. So if I had one big takeaway, that's that we want to stop attackers before they get on our machine. So even if we don't find all of the different privilege escalation vulnerabilities, even if we don't find all the persistence methods, that's okay. We're not going to worry about that too much. We're going to mostly focus on our external attack surface, or how attackers get into our machines in the first place. That's kind of the big idea, that our external attack surface, or the way attackers are gaining initial access, that is what's key here. So what we're going to do is we're going to determine which services should be accessible. We're going to block any services that shouldn't be accessible. Then we're going to secure all the services that should be accessible. That includes updating them to the latest version and taking a look at each of those attack vectors that are associated with that service that we talked about in previous videos. You can always go back to this attack vectors checklist or cheat sheet if you wanted a reminder of what those were for each service. Then from there, the only way, in theory, that Red Team can stop us is via things that run on a schedule or things that run when a specific event occurs. So if we have this strong firewall up, and if the services that are exposed are really, really well secure, there's really nothing that Red Team can do to get in, other than things that they pre-baked into our machine that can potentially destroy our setup, right? So that's what I mean, things that run on a schedule. So for example, cron jobs or at jobs or systemd timers. And there are many different things that run on a schedule that the attacker can use to kind of undo some of the things that we did, like for example, take down our firewall, right? So we're really going to want to take a look at those things that run on a schedule or that run when a specific event occurs, such as on boot. And we're going to see if those potentially do anything bad. The second thing that I want to point out is that a lot of these persistence mechanisms that we talk about and rely on a reboot or rely on a service being restarted or a user logging back in. Why is that important? Well, that means you should try to reboot your machine as little as possible. I see a lot of teams that think that the defense strategy when the attacker gets in, let's shut off our machine and that's going to kick the attacker out. That's actually one of the worst things you can do, because as soon as you restart that machine, maybe the attacker didn't have full access, but all of those persistence things that they baked into your machine are going to get triggered when you reboot it, and maybe now they're going to have full access to your machine. So whatever you do, I like to avoid rebooting as much as I possibly can. You want to avoid rebooting, you want to avoid logging out if you can, you want to avoid restarting services as much as you can, so we don't trigger those events that may cause some of those persistence mechanisms to be activated, right? Then the last thing we're going to do is, for when the attacker does unfortunately get on our machine, we're going to prepare for actively defending. So that's going to be a combination of monitoring network traffic with Wireshark and also auditing on our own machine, looking at what commands the attacker ran when they got in. So we need to get that set up. Then if you have extra time and you're feeling adventurous, you can always check for some privilege escalation or persistence attack vectors in addition to all of those other things. Let's take a look at the more complete checklist. This is the checklist I'll be following throughout the rest of this video. So if you ever forget one of the things that I did, you can always go back to this checklist, and here it is all written out. So it's competition day, and I have this machine that I want to set up and configure. Let's say that it's supposed to have two services running on it. So one is a web service that's supposed to be accessible on ports 80 and 443. The other one is an SSH service that's supposed to be accessible on port 22. And let's say I have one scoring on user here, and that scoring user is named Jay Rice, so I can't remove that scoring user. And that's the information that I'm given in the instructions, and it's time for me to go ahead and configure this machine. While I'm setting up my machine, I want it to be connected to the network as little as possible. This is so that while I'm setting things up, attackers can't jump in and already start messing with me, right? I want to have my own space to set everything up, and only then I'm going to bring this machine online. How do I achieve this? Well, the way I like to do it is I just bring down the interface that is connecting me to the network. So if I do IPA, you'll see I see my IP here, 10.0.0.11, and the interface associated with that is ENPOS8 or 0S8. So that interface is allowing me to connect to the network. I can bring that down with IP link set dev and then the name of the interface, so ENPOS8 down. Now if I run IPA again, you'll see that it says state down, and I actually won't be able to connect to that network anymore. Even while I'm setting things up, there are certain things that I will need to be connected to the network for. For example, in a later video, we're going to be installing updates. Also in a later video, we'll be scanning our machine with Nmap to make sure that we set up our firewall rules correctly. In those cases, I need to bring the machine back on the network temporarily so that I can actually access the internet, right? In order to do that, I pretty much do the opposite of before. I will say IP link set dev the interface, and then instead of down, I'm actually going to say up, and that's going to bring that interface back up. And now if I run IPA, you can see that that interface is back up and running again. So I'm not going to show this in future videos, but just keep this in mind while you're doing all the things that I'm doing in those videos. I highly recommend, if something doesn't require internet access, bring that interface down, and so attackers can't potentially get on and disrupt what you're doing. But if you do need internet access, you can bring it back up. And then at the very end, when you have everything configured and you finally set up your logging and monitoring, which is the last thing we're going to do, then you can go ahead and bring this back up permanently, and you should be good to go.